Welcome to Too Lady to Rest, where we talk about art, culture, and all things vintage gossip. If you've seen the newest season of the TV show Feud, you probably already know all about Truman Capote's double-crossing of the socialites he called his Swans. How after years of being intimately acquainted and trusted with their darkest secrets, he exposed them through a scandalous short story called La Côte Basque 1965, published in Esquire magazine in 1975. However, in today's video, we're going to talk about how one of Truman Capote's Swans actually may have betrayed him. Or did she? Truman Capote was a celebrated writer and a pioneer in terms of LGBTQ+ representation, having acquired fame and recognition as an openly gay writer in the late 1940s. His breakout work was the novel Other Voices, Other Rooms, first published in 1948. The main character is a young gay boy trying to figure out his identity in the Deep South, where life was exceptionally hard for queer people. And his journey mirrors that of Capote himself, who was raised by relatives in Alabama. At the time, the novel was considered even more scandalous and gay because of this photo. This was the photo that Truman Capote chose as his author portrait on the back cover of the book. So he's basically a twink reclining on a sofa with a come hither look in his eyes in 1948. While Other Voices, Other Rooms did bring him some initial recognition, it wasn't until he published In Cold Blood, which Capote described as a non-fiction novel, a completely new genre, by the way, which he pioneered. With that book, he became really famous and rich. The book was a product of Capote's reporting of a murder for New Yorker magazine, for which he traveled to Kansas accompanied by his friend and fellow writer Harper Lee. Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, was Truman's childhood friend. They grew up together. So while he was reporting on this murder, Truman developed this weird relationship with one of the murderers, Perry Smith. He went there basically to write one article on it for New Yorker magazine, but he ended up writing an entire book about it. He decided that it was meant to be a book. And when he talked to this Perry Smith guy, he saw himself in a weird, bizarre way. This is portrayed in the movie Capote with Philip Seymour Hoffman playing Capote. He saw himself in this man because apparently this man had similar origins to Truman's own origins. So basically, he was also abandoned by his parents and had a lot of issues because of that. And Truman had been through similar things, and he felt that he wasn't that distant from ending up like Perry Smith. It's like they're two sides of the same coin. It could easily be him in Perry's place, is what he thought. And he decided to write this book, and he helped pay for lawyers for these murderers to try and get them like a better deal, I guess. But they got the death penalty, and Truman even attended Smith's execution. It was really intense. And, you know, the book was so successful. Some people say that it was the inception of the true crime genre. Like, that this was it. This was what started modern true crime as we know it. And I kind of agree. Now, the fame and the prestige that he acquired through this novel was what ultimately really allowed him to infiltrate the upper echelons of New York City society, high society. Truman lived with his relatives in Alabama with his aunts. When he grew up, he went to live with his mother in New York. His mother had married a man called Joe Garcia Capote, who actually adopted Truman and gave him his surname. Truman's original surname was Persons. And Joe Garcia Capote was a Cuban immigrant, like I said, and he made good money working at a brokerage firm. They had a very vibrant social life, and they did have a high standard of living, but they were not high society. Like, they didn't have any generational wealth. They just weren't in the same circles. And this really frustrated Truman's mother, Nina. Nina's original name is Lily Mae, but when she went to New York, she ditched the name because she thought it was a little too Southern sounding, and she adopted Nina, which she thought was like a really chic name, very like cosmopolitan New York name. I like Lily Mae, I think it's cute, but it's a different vibe for sure. And Nina was a narcissist. Nina was a narcissist, and she instilled in Truman also this desire to be accepted in high society. So it brought him great pleasure to seek out this clout. And thanks to his literary success and his significant rizz, Truman began making friends with high society women. whose physical beauty and old money clout he was drawn to like nothing else. He essentially became the gay BFF of these women. Several different women, by the way, and all of them really depended on him for validation, reassurance, emotional support, advice, entertainment. Truman was important to them, and he found significant pleasure in fulfilling this role because Truman was the life of the party wherever he went. Truman was a great storyteller, hilarious, and he always had gossip from everyone because everyone had this weird feeling that they could trust Truman, which couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, he was a gossip through and through. He was the worst kind of gossip, honestly. He would hear his friends' problems. He would go to his other friends and tell the previous friends' problems as new information and gossip to basically exchange for a little clout. And he did that to every single one of his friends. And some of them, I think the more like street smart ones, like Slim Keith, I think she kind of knew that and she didn't trust him. She wouldn't tell him her secrets, but Babe Paley told him all of her secrets, and so did Lee Radziwill. So by gaining their approval and making them dependent on his friendship, I think in a way it's like Truman is almost compensating for his relationship with his own mother, because she always cared more about herself than her son, and she was intensely homophobic. I mean, she was very frustrated that Truman was gay, and especially that he was so effeminate, because Truman could never pass as straight, even if he tried. He was too gay to function. It was just impossible. He was very effeminate. And Lily Mae, Nina, she didn't like that. She was frustrated by that for sure. So I think that being so important to these women probably validated him in that place. And there was always this very important aspect, which was their beauty. He worshipped their beauty, their physical gracefulness. They were swans, right? That's where the comparison comes from, obviously. They were beautiful, and he was obsessed with their beauty. So I think being important to them really helped him cope with the immense heteronormative pressure he was probably under his entire life, until he ruined everything in 1975, like I said, when he published La Côte Basque 1965, which was the short story where he blabbed about a bunch of scandalous things that had happened to these women, many of whom had told him these secrets in the strictest confidence, but there was no such thing for Truman. And one of these women, the one that is relevant to today's video, is Princess Lee Radziwill. She was the sister of Jackie Kennedy. Caroline Lee Bouvier was born on March 3rd, 1933, 4 years after her later-to-be illustrious sister Jacqueline. Her maternal grandparents, Margaret Merritt and James Thomas Lee, were second-generation Irish immigrants who achieved prestige and riches through his banking career, while Lee's paternal ancestor was, according to Lee's biographer, quote, impoverished and uneducated, a petit bourgeois artisan and apprentice cabinet maker by trade, eventually amassing $1 million fortune through hard work and good luck, end quote. Both sides of Lee's family were deeply affected by the 1929 crash, particularly her father, Jack Bouvier, who never went back to making the $75,000 a year that he used to make before the crash. And that was a lot of money at the time, almost $1.5 million today. He eventually descended into alcoholism, and when he died in 1957, he left nothing to either of his daughters. So Jackie and Lee got nothing from their dad. These parents divorced when she was 5 years old, and her mother eventually remarried and had 2 other children with Hugh D. Auchincloss. Now remember that name, we're going to come back to him later in the video. Lee became very close to her sister Jackie at this time, when their parents divorced and everything, because they both felt, very displaced, very rejected. Their dad led this life full of debauchery. They lived with their mom, and their mom remarried this guy and had 2 other children with him, and it was like she had a new family basically, so they felt really alone in the world, which interestingly reminds me of Truman's own story a bit, doesn't it? But Lee and Jackie had a large age gap. I mean, 4 years for children, it's a lot. And they had very different temperaments. So Lee ended up most of the time just in her own world. I mean, she was a Pisces, so her friends were like these whimsical characters that she created, and she lived these like fantasy lives. And these experiences, they made her very guarded, very hard to get close to. But when she met Truman in 1960, Lee was married to her second husband, by the way, Prince Stanislaus Radziwill. And he had the title of prince, but it was symbolic. He meant nothing anymore. He was Polish. They just had the titles basically, and he used it. He styled his name like that, and Lee, of course, styled her name as Princess Lee Radziwill. I mean, work. Who doesn't want to be a princess, right? When she met Truman, they became so close so fast, which was weird because, like I said, Lee was very reserved, and she immediately just like almost trauma dumped on him. Like she told him so much, like about her ambivalence about her marriage. She wasn't sure if they were going to stay together. This was 1960. So basically this was right around the time that she was getting her first marriage annulled so that she could marry Radziwill in the church. We're going to touch on that later in the video. She also told him about her resentment that she felt toward Jackie, just the intense jealousy. She just felt that Jackie had everything and she had nothing. Like she wanted the recognition, she wanted the fame, all that Jackie had, and the way that people treated her, the way they admired her. Lee felt that she should have had that too, because she felt that Jackie was very uncreative, that everything that Jackie was complimented with came from Lee, basically, and Lee's influence on her. And Truman basically promptly repeated all of her secrets to Cecil Beaton in a letter. Photographer Cecil Beaton, who was their mutual friend, he basically just wrote Cecil Beaton and was like, "My God, how jealous she is of Jackie. I never knew." He also said, "Understand her marriage is all but finito." So he immediately blabbed to someone else. And they were so close that their relationship was often compared to a romantic infatuation of sorts. In fact, when he was being interviewed by Gerald Clark, his biographer, Truman implied that he and Lee had sex once on a trip to Morocco. I don't know how true that is, but I mean, it's not hard to understand why they appeal to each other though, right? I mean, for Truman, Lee's access to the Kennedys was a huge plus. The Kennedys at the time, I mean, 1960, the Kennedys were the height of clout, the height of glamour. They were A+++ list. I mean, he was the president, right? Elect, but they were just beyond just being a president, just being a politician. I mean, there was Jackie and the society stuff, and the Kennedys were a family that was well known. They were a famous family, and people thought they were glamorous. But most of all, Jack was the president and Robert Kennedy was the attorney general, so they were really, I mean, they had clout, they had power, and Truman was drawn to this. So that was one reason. But I think that she also represented sort of this ideal of heterosexual love object, because Truman was always so adamant about their beauty, the Swans' beauty, and they're just perfect looks. They're like almost like they're Greek goddesses. And I think that Lee, if he were attracted to women at all, Lee was probably the kind of wife that he would have chosen, because in his mind, at least in his head, he feels like she is this ideal. And I think that being this close to her, even close enough to give off the vibes of being lovers, I think was very validating for him. Almost like in a way, it made up for his flamboyant nature, right? And in Lee's eyes, Truman was a respected and acclaimed author, thanks to the success of his books, and especially in Cold Blood. And associating with him, I think, lent her some respectability, because there's this respectability that's inherent to artists, because what they do is something considered to be something of substance. And I think that Lee really gravitated towards that. She really wanted to feel validated by hanging out with this crowd. She loved artists. Despite her socialite status, Lee was really disenchanted by the idea of being a society woman. I mean, she saw how empty that life was, and she wasn't happy with it. She wanted to be an artist. She wanted to create something. She wanted to do things of substance. She had this sort of impetus inside of her to seek that out. And this was very much encouraged by her hanging out with these people who were amazing artists, like Truman Capote, dancers Rudolf Nureyev and Margot Fontaine, photographers Cecil Beaton and Peter Beard, who later became her boyfriend when she left her second husband, and even Andy Warhol was also her buddy. So through these friendships, Lee eventually came to the realization that her socialite life was not enough for her, and she just really wanted to find her own sense of purpose by exploring herself artistically. To this end, she picked acting. She wanted to be an actress. By the way, Jackie also wanted to be an actress at a certain point in her life. So I wonder why Lee picked that. Besides seeming like the most accessible art form, even though it really isn't. Acting isn't easy. At least it's not easy to do well. But I think for people who don't really have a lot of talent or substance, acting can seem accessible. I think that's why she picked it. And most of her friends, including Cecil Beaton and Rudolf Nureyev, they advised her to start small, get small roles, just try to build your experience, your portfolio, just learn acting. Start small, which I think is great advice for anybody starting out. But Truman always insisted that she was a star, a natural star, and he offered to help her get a leading role because he had connections in the acting world, because he had adaptations of his works and stuff like that. He'd worked on plays and everything, so he had connections, and he did get her a leading role. Unfortunately, Lee was described as being kind of easily led.
Or as easily led.
Like, she didn't listen to the most reasonable voice in the room. She listened to the loudest voice in the room. And that loudest voice, in most rooms that Truman was in, his was the loudest voice. And especially when it came to Lee. So with Truman's help, Lee got the role of Tracy Lord, a socialite. So a very challenging role, I'm sure, in the play The Philadelphia Story, which opened in a 600-seat Chicago playhouse called the Ivanhoe Theater. This can be a whole other video, but basically, although some of her co-stars said that she was really an okay actor, her stage debut attracted unrelenting media attention just because she was Jackie Kennedy's sister. Lee was afflicted with crippling anxiety, insomnia, stage fright. She was terrified, but she kept on. And throughout all of this, throughout the rehearsals, the shows, Truman remained by her side, never wavering in his blind belief in her star quality somehow. According to her co-star Bob Thompson, Truman would show up in rehearsal and, quote, sometimes he would sit up at the top of the balcony, and if she turned a certain way, or said a line in a certain way, there would be these strange little sounds of adoration coming from up there, like, yes, that's right. Oh, it's wonderful, Lee, wonderful, end quote. I mean, the projection, I can't. But Lee, whose husband was completely opposed to all of this, he did not support her at all in her acting efforts. He just felt that she was exposing herself unnecessarily, like she was exposing herself to ridicule. And her husband just didn't feel like it was productive in any way. I mean, he didn't really understand her artistic yearnings or anything. He was just embarrassed. They all were, I think, her family and everybody. But, this meant that Truman was basically the only person supporting her. And she really appreciated his loyalty, honestly, and his support. She later declared that, quote, his friendship, his loyalty, his caring were something very special. I've never had such a friend, end quote. And at the time, she reportedly told him in a letter, quote, when I want advice, I feel you're in the room giving it to me. When I want to laugh at something, I can hear you laughing with me, and that makes me so much happier. I was so happy to get your letter, except that it made me weep because I miss you so much and need you to make life worthwhile, end quote. She even gifted him this chic cigarette box. It's a gold-lined Schlumberger cigarette box, and it had the inscription, quote, to my answered prayer with love, Lee, July 1967, end quote. Despite Truman's effusive reactions to the rehearsals, the play was not wonderful. It just wasn't. I mean, the audience reportedly liked the play well enough. I mean, people went to see it. I think mostly because they were so curious to see Jackie Kennedy's sister acting. But actor Bob Thompson, again, her co-star, he claimed that there were women in the audience that would just begin loudly discussing Lee's costumes whenever she had a costume change, which was, by the way, between every scene. And her costumes were Yves Saint Laurent, and she would fly to Paris for fittings. So the female members of the audience at least went to see her costumes, and they would discuss it, and they wanted to see it. They just ignored everybody else in the play. So I'm sure the other actors loved that. But drama critics were really harsh and unkind to Lee. They basically criticized her for being too inexperienced to take such a prominent role, which they were right. I mean, you give a person with zero acting experience a leading role. That's a disaster waiting to happen. Give her a walk-in role. And it didn't help that Truman kept gassing her up. I mean, with all of this and no substance to back it up, and Truman gassing her up like this, I'm sure people were rooting for her downfall just on principle alone. It's not like she meant any harm, obviously, but that just makes people hate you. But regardless of her lukewarmness on stage, her handlers believed in her. They claimed that she'd performed reasonably well for an amateur, which may very well be true, and they figured that she'd translate better on TV. So Truman basically got her cast in a remake of Otto Preminger's 19 1944 film Laura, and he offered to adapt the script himself, I guess, to sweeten the pot for them to get it funded. But the production was fraught with problems, many of which involved the script and the fact that Truman refused to do any rewrites, and Lee often came late and unprepared to rehearsals. So they were so unhappy with her performance that they considered just firing her and replacing her with another actor. And reportedly, Truman even supported this. So basically at this time, it really seems like he was starting to see that he had made a huge mistake. He wasn't into it anymore. I think he was embarrassed. It was very cringy, very cringy. So, it became clear during the production of Laura that Truman had basically checked out of the whole thing. Like, he didn't believe in it anymore. He wouldn't respond to the production. He basically just ghosted them. During a preview party given by producer David Susskind, director John Moxey recalled that, quote, "There was a moment when Truman and I were alone watching one of the monitors, and just by the look on his face, I realized that he was desperately unhappy and that he felt it had all been a terrible mistake. But when asked about it, he tried to jolly it along and put his best face on it," end quote. In the end, a lot of her performance ended up on the cutting room floor, but even so, the film's reception was really catastrophic. Truman's biographer Gerald Clark puts it like this, quote, "More than one reviewer pointed out that when the camera should have been looking at her, it wandered off in other directions, as if it were too polite to embarrass her. As a result, her Laura was reduced to a stunning clothes horse upon whom no discernible thespian demands were made," said Jack Gould, the New York Times television critic. When she was glimpsed on screen, she was, said Time, only slightly less animated than the portrait of herself that hung over the mantel. Yikes. Clark goes on. The negative reaction finally finished Lee's acting career. It is hard to say who looked sillier at the end of their quixotic adventure, but that unhappy honor probably belonged to Truman, who publicly demonstrated that where Lee was concerned, he had no judgment at all. Trying to be kind, he had succeeded only in being cruel. Instead of making her a star, he had turned her into a figure of fun and ridicule, end quote. Brutal. Years later, Truman would admit on David Susskind's talk show that the media scrutiny that they received was far beyond any of their expectations. And he stated that Lee became this kind of target for people to project their negative feelings about Jackie Kennedy. So at the time, Jackie was still viewed as a saint. This was 1967. So this was before she married Onassis, but she obviously had been a widow for several years now. So she was still on a pedestal as far as the general public was concerned.
I hadn't foreseen it to the extent that it did, but I did foresee that no matter what she did, the press was going to come down on her like hell, and not entirely because of Lee Radziwill, but because a great deal of the press, and particularly at that time, less so now than it, but at that time they really wanted to say nasty things about Mrs. Kennedy, about Jackie, but they never could, because at that time Jackie was still a little saint. Mr. Onassis had never appeared on the horizon. She was still the widow lady, you know? But underneath all of that, there was a tremendous animosity of envy for this beautiful girl who had everything. And here was this sister of hers, Lee Radziwill, having the nerve, because she was the sister of Mrs. Kennedy. Everybody said, oh, she wouldn't have even gotten the job if she wasn't Mrs. Kennedy's sister, which is perfectly true. Everybody was aware of that. And she wouldn't have gotten the job. Nobody, David Susskind wouldn't have produced it. ABC wouldn't have put it on the air. Naturally, it was going to have a whole thing come down on it, bang, you know? I didn't realize it would be quite so severe as it was, but even she knew that, but she was willing to take the risk because she wanted very much to have a life of her own.
And I think that Truman's insight is very pertinent. You know, I think it makes a lot of sense. Shortly before the release of Laura, the movie that she was making, Lee joined Truman on a trip to his home state of Alabama because they were going to shoot a film adaptation of one of Truman's short stories, The Thanksgiving Visitor. The story was based on his childhood, so the movie set was basically recreating his childhood home with everything in the right place. You know, all of his memories just come to life. And he had even dedicated this short story to Lee. So when he went to Alabama to be there for the shooting, he decided to invite some of his relatives and do kind of a family reunion of sorts. So he paid for all the expenses himself, and he invited his family, and they did like a picnic. But it was very weird. I mean, a lot of his family was very homophobic, and Truman was very, very effeminate. Truman's dad was there, and his relationship with his dad is really tense, and he was always asking Truman for money and trying to like leech off of his clout. So I think it was a mixed experience for Truman. And I think it says a lot that he invited Lee to be with him in this situation. And throughout the entire experience, reportedly Truman held Lee's hand the entire time. So she was really there for emotional support. And they were so physically close and always holding hands to an extent where his homophobic father was convinced that Truman was actually straight and that he was gonna marry Lee. Truman was also there for Lee when Jackie decided to marry Aristotle Onassis. And this was a crisis because Lee had been having an affair with Onassis for several years now, and she really hoped to marry Onassis. She really set her eyes on that billion-dollar fortune, and she wanted that for herself. She was already his mistress, and she was really like sort of biding her time, trying to snag him, and then Jackie did. This was a huge hit for Lee, huge, who, according to Truman, quote, really thought she had Onassis nailed down, end quote. And she was already so jealous of Jackie. I mean, Jesus Christ, like, couldn't she have anything for herself, you know? Just a billionaire. That's all she asked for. And this whole thing with Onassis and the Bouvier sisters, it deserves another video, basically. It's so crazy. Lee was his mistress. She was the one who insisted that Jackie come on the yacht, on Onassis's yacht, which was called the Christina. She was the one who insisted that Jackie come on the yacht, and Onassis basically set his sights on her at that point. So Lee was basically just the stepping stone. Jackie was the real trophy that Onassis wanted. In the 1970s, Truman and Lee toured with the Rolling Stones, along with Lee's then boyfriend Peter Beard, who was a photographer. By then, there were hints that Lee's and Truman's friendship was getting weird. There was the whole thing with the acting project, the fiasco, and the fact that by the end of it, even Truman, who was blindly supporting her, was aware of the disaster that it was. So there were cracks. And a really bizarre thing that happened on this tour was that after they made a stop in Dallas on the tour, Lee was kind of haunted by, you know, being where Jack had been assassinated and everything. She wanted to return home. But Peter wanted to continue on the tour with Truman. And according to Lee's biographer, Lee and Peter had this massive fight about this, during which, quote, Lee kept saying over and over to him that Truman wanted them to break up and that it was his dream to break up any heterosexual relationship. Peter Beard was the first serious male claim on Lee's attention since she and Truman had become friends, and it seems he reacted with jealousy to this formidable new arrival, end quote. Can you compare this Lee to the one that less than 10 years before was saying to Truman that she loved him, he was her only friend? Now she's using the F slur? Like, girl. In 1975, of course, La Côte Basque 1965 was released and published. And this did add like a layer of tension to their relationship, obviously. I mean, all of their mutual friends were casting out Truman. It wasn't cool to be friends with Truman anymore. But in the actual story, there wasn't much to offend her there. Like, he didn't tell any of her secrets. And he had many secrets of hers to tell, but he didn't tell any of them. Not only that, but he was extremely complimentary to Lee in this short story, basically. He writes, quote, I've often thought of it, how perfect she was. A gleaming gold-brown girl in a white bathing suit, her white skis hissing smoothly, her brown gold hair whipping as she swooped and skidded between the waves, end quote. Lady Ina Coolberth, the character that is strongly believed to represent Slim Keith, later adds, quote, if I were a man, I'd fall for Lee myself. She's marvelously made, like a Tanagra figurine. She's feminine without being effeminate, and she's one of the few people I've known who can be both candid and cozy. Ordinarily, one cancels the other. Jackie? No, not on the same planet. Very photogenic, of course, but the effect is a little unrefined, exaggerated, end quote. So not only did he compliment Lee in a very over-the-top way, but he also shaded Jackie, which was just so gratuitous. So basically, for some reason, their once intense friendship really cooled off in the 1970s, and like most real-life relationships, it's not really clear why this happened. I mean, we'll touch on this a little later in the video, but we don't know if basically they grew apart or if there was a specific event or events that caused the rift between them. But by the end of the 1970s, they were basically on like distant but not bad terms. Like, they were a little cool toward each other, you know, not really friends anymore. But the 70s were a really bad decade for Truman just overall. And in 1975, not only did all of this happen with the short story and everything and his dismissal from high society, but in 1975, his longtime rival, fellow author Gore Vidal, sued Truman for libel. Born as Eugene Luther Vidal Jr. on October 3rd, 1925, 1 year and 3 days after Truman Capote entered this world, by the way, Gore Vidal was the grandson of a U.S. senator and had great ambitions almost from the moment of his birth. He hoped to become both a celebrated writer and a successful politician. Very ambitious. And these two ambitions of his were really like warring with each other because to be a writer, he felt that he had to be honest about himself. He had to write about the things that happened to him. He had to expose himself in a way. But being a politician, I mean, you can't do that. It's not like other jobs that you can basically have both. If you're a politician, you can't be a writer, at least not in the way that they wanted to be writers and the kinds of writings that he wanted to do. Much like Truman, Gore Vidal was also the son of an overbearing, narcissistic mother named Nina. Yes, their mothers share the same name. Although Gore Vidal's biographer indicates that Gore Vidal's mom's name should be pronounced Nina instead of Nina, but I haven't seen that anywhere else. I'm just gonna call her Nina. So they both had these like really cruel, narcissistic mothers who would sooner give them a rebuke than a kind word. Nina divorced Gore's father when he was 10 years old, and she quickly went on trying to find herself a new rich husband because even though her family was moneyed, she really did not want to depend on her parents. So she found this guy to marry. His name was Hugh D. Auchincloss. Now, maybe you'll remember that earlier in the video, I mentioned this name, and I told you, remember this name? Do you remember this name? Well, it's here. I'm reminding you. This is the dude that married Jackie and Lee's mother. So he was the second husband of Jackie and Lee's mother. Before he married Jackie and Lee's mother, he was married to Gore Vidal's mother. So Gore Vidal and the Bouvier sisters shared a stepfather, basically, not at the same time, but they shared a stepfather. And Gore Vidal and Jackie even shared a room growing up. They didn't share a room physically. They used the same room when they were in Marywood, which was the main Auchincloss estate. So Gore Vidal's childhood bedroom was Jackie's childhood bedroom. Now, Auchincloss was a stockbroker and his family had been rich for centuries. They had a lot of money. Described as an unassuming man attracted to aggressively high-spirited women, Auchincloss, or Hudie as he was known to his family members, was also looking to remarry after he divorced his first wife, with whom he had a son already. And Nina, I mean, aggressively high-spirited, that's her. She really caught his eye. He fell in love with her like crazy. He was not her number one candidate though. She was really into this other dude, but she ended up settling for Auchincloss because of his money. But she was so like sort of grossed out by him, she felt like no sexual attraction to him at all, that she even included a provision in their prenup saying that she wasn't required to have sex with him. Her need for security spoke louder and whatever. And she later had 2 more children with him, which doesn't mean that she had sex with him. So apparently, Janet, Jackie and Lee's mother, she also had 2 more children with Auchincloss when she married him. However, her biographer claims that Auchincloss was impotent, but Janet really wanted to have more children with him. So I guess he was impotent for sex, but he could like come in a cup. I don't know. Anyways, apparently she used a turkey baster to impregnate herself. And supposedly Auchincloss's previous wife had done the same. Who was Auchincloss's previous wife? Gore Vidal's mom, Nina. So I think that she didn't have to have sex with him. She just had the children. And it worked. Since childhood, Gore was a voracious reader, and he had a very artistically inclined mind from the start. I mean, he was always role-playing with his toy soldiers, like creating these stories. He had a theatrical makeup kit. He liked to like reenact important historical moments, and he would put on little shows and everything. And because he was like this as a kid, apparently Gore Vidal's mom, Nina, was warned by a family friend who was, in Gore's own words, quote, and a bisexual, end quote. He warned Nina that Gore's taste for the theatrical might indicate homosexuality. Now, Nina was a little alarmed by that, so she took him to a mental health professional, and this mental health professional asked him questions about his sexuality or about sex, I don't know, to this child, to which Gore recalls giving, quote, perfectly polite answers, end quote. After this, he relates that Nina lost interest basically in the entire thing. So she wasn't like actively homophobic like the other Nina Capote. She decided to undermine Gore's self-worth in other ways. And although Gore was never really interested in labeling himself, I think that, I would tentatively apply to him the label of bisexual because he did have relationships with men and women. I find this really unusual. He had this view of sex that was like, it was just bodily pleasure to him. And as long as it felt natural, he thought it was worth pursuing. So he just went with the flow as far as his desires went. Years later, Gore's mom, Nina, Nina fell in love with another man. She didn't really love Auchincloss to begin with. She just married him for security. But she fell in love with another dude. She left Hugh the Auchincloss and she took Gore with her. And like we talked about, his next wife was Janet Bouvier, the mother of Jackie and Lee. So although they never interacted as children, they did share that sort of like weird family piece, I guess. And Gore Vidal had his younger siblings, his younger Auchincloss siblings, who lived with their father. So they were raised partly by Lee's mother, Janet. So Jackie and Lee were basically raised with Gore Vidal's younger siblings. So they had a weird kind of relationship there, weird kind of connection. Gore Vidal met Truman Capote in 1945 at a party thrown by author Anais Nin. Gore was immediately put off by Truman, who seemed to him to be, quote, excessively and self-promotingly effeminate, an extravagant queen, eager to use his mannerisms to make sure people remembered him, end quote. Gore was the opposite. Unlike Truman, Gore Vidal did come from these high society families. He did come from that old money world that Truman was so fascinated by, and the way he presented himself as well was completely different. Like, he was described as much more distinguished looking than Truman, you know, a lot more chic and sophisticated, elegant. He just had that quality. And meanwhile, Gore was really envious of Truman's literary success, which was much more substantial than his would ever be, really. So I mean, that was kind of a point of contention. I always think of Mozart and Salieri kind of feeling like this deep resentment for this other guy who was more successful than him, but whom he believed to be less deserving of success than him. And Gore's deep resentment of Truman is really obvious in this quote. Quote, "The instant lie was Truman's art form, small, but paradoxically authentic. One could watch the process. A famous name would be mentioned. The round, pale fetus face would suddenly register a sort of tick, as if a switch had been thrown. Eleanor Roosevelt. Oh, I know her intimately," end quote. A rivalry soon developed and they became kind of like frenemies a little bit. They were both kind of put off by one another for different reasons, but at the same time, they were like irresistibly drawn to each other in a way. Not sexually, but like, I think they really saw each other in the other, but didn't really like what they saw. During these early years, although they weren't really friends by any stretch of the imagination, they were kind of friendly. Truman even once included Gore Vidal when he was describing like his literary friends in like a general way. He mentioned Vidal, so he included him in that group of like his literary friends. But Vidal, on the other hand, was so bothered by Truman's mere existence that he just came off as extremely obsessed. He once ranted to a mutual acquaintance of theirs that Truman would often full out lie about having met famous people. And this person, this acquaintance, was like, this is a jealous exaggeration. They were kind of like put off by Gore Vidal, like, girl, no. But it turns out that this person was later in a situation with Truman and the famous French writer André Gide, whom Truman had claimed to have met before. And it was just really obvious when they came face to face that they had never met before, because you can tell, right? I mean, the way two people sort of react to each other when they're meeting for the first time is different than when they've met before. So it was obvious that Truman had never met this dude. So this person was like, oh my God, Gore Vidal was right. So even though Gore Vidal came off as like a raving lunatic, and maybe he was kind of a raving lunatic, he was not wrong. He was totally right about Truman being a liar, ironically, you know, because Truman, true man, liar. Okay. So like, Vidal was fully aware that Truman was a liar. And this is probably why, after Truman told Playgirl magazine that Gore Vidal had been bodily thrown out of the White House by Robert Kennedy, this was the last straw for Gore Vidal, and he decided to sue Truman for libel finally. On November 11th, 1961, the Kennedys gave their first major dinner at the White House. It was both in honor of the Radzivills for some reason. I mean, I think it was just an excuse for a party, which I'm not mad at all. And also to celebrate almost a year of the Kennedy presidency. Their friends, the Agnellis, who were the owners of Fiat, were also guests of honor at this party. While Truman Capote was not on the guest list, Gore Vidal, who was a political hopeful and once a sort of step-sibling to the First Lady, he was there. And reportedly during the party, there was an incident involving Gore Vidal and the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. 14 years later, in 1975, Truman Capote described this event in an interview to Playgirl magazine. Here's the relevant excerpt. Quote, "Why did Vidal resent the Kennedys so terribly? The feud between Vidal and the family was well known, although somewhat one-sided, because the only one who made a public issue of it was Vidal. The reasons behind it had never been stated. Well, Well, I think it goes back to when Bobby had Gore thrown out of the White House. It was the only time he had ever been invited to the White House, and he got drunk and he insulted Jackie's mother, whom he had never met before in his life. But I mean insulted her. He said something to the effect that he had always hated her, but he'd never even met the woman. And she just went into something like total shock. And Bobby and Arthur Schlesinger, I believe it was, and one of the guards just picked Gore up and carried him to the door and threw him out into Pennsylvania Avenue. That's when he began to write all those cruel pieces about the Kennedys, end quote. A few months later, amid his growing alcoholism and his struggles with the aftermath of the publication of La Côte Basque, so basically losing all of his friends, Truman was blindsided by this lawsuit. And Vidal demanded not only a public apology from Truman, or maybe it wasn't a public apology, just an apology, I don't know, and $1 million as well. Vidal had been so incensed after reading Truman's boozy comments to Playgirl magazine that it made him want to ruin Truman's reputation by exposing him as a liar and his financial life by making him pay $1 million. Now, Truman Capote's financial life was already not great. Like, he didn't have $1 million, honestly. His money had been dwindling since his heyday. And the lawsuit dragged on for several years. Now, according to Truman's biographer, he expected from the start that Lee would come forward and confirm his story, basically, because he claimed that she was the source of the story in the first place. But she did not. Not only did she not come to his rescue, by 1979, she just fully turned against him and testified against him in court. She declared, quote, "I do not recall ever discussing with Truman Capote the incident or the evening which I understand is the subject of this lawsuit," end quote. And this, of course, ruined any chance that Truman had of winning this lawsuit. I don't think that he had much of a chance, but he was like deeply shocked. He was so hurt. He was like, Lee, who, you know, was his best friend, whose acting career he had basically been responsible for jump-starting. I mean, if she'd had the talent to keep it, you know what I mean? And he was at a loss. He said, quote, "Why Lee betrayed me is one of the world's greatest mysteries, like those statues on Easter Island," end quote. Whether he really had no idea why, I don't know. But other people were apparently as puzzled by her behavior as him. So other people didn't really see it coming either. Because Lee was not returning Truman's calls, he pestered a reporter called Liz Smith to intervene on his behalf and basically talk to Lee for him and everything. And Liz Smith reported that Lee's answer was this, quote, "I'm tired of Truman riding on my coattails to fame. And Liz, what difference does it make? They're just a couple of end quote. After he found out that Lee had said this, Truman was just enraged. He had been racking his brain looking for why she could have done this, thinking of anything he had done to offend her. And all along it was just pure homophobia, you know what I mean? From his once closest friend, whom he had now taken to refer to as the Principessa. He apparently demanded, quote, "If the lovely, divine, and sensitive Princess Radziwill has such a low opinion of homosexuals, then why did she have me for a confidant for the last 20 years, end quote. He has a point. He had kept her secrets all these years, I guess. I mean, he didn't publish them or anything, but no more. Truman now was in his feelings. He'd been sober for over a year now, but he felt like he was clear-headed and he just wanted to get his revenge, right? So he wasn't high. This was planned. This was meticulously planned. So on June 5th, 1979, he arranged to appear on the Stanley Siegel show, where he intended to reveal all of Lee's most intimate secrets. He created this character that he called the Southern complete with a heavy Southern accent, and he performed what was meant to be a bit, I guess, a set piece, and he planned the rhythm. I mean, he planned meticulously everything, and it wasn't that bad. I mean, by some accounts, the performance was even a little compelling, but, you know, the host quickly became alarmed and began interrupting Truman, and it really sort of ruined the mood and killed the performance. So it's kind of like, but luckily Truman had asked journalist Sally Quinn to accompany him to the show and documented all of it. And after the stunt didn't go as he planned, he basically spilled the beans to the journalist later anyway. He told Quinn about how unimaginably jealous Lee was of Jackie, how cattily she spoke of the Kennedys, calling them dull and comparing their skin to leather, her crushes on Jack Kennedy and Rudolf Nureyev, how her second husband Staj Radziwill wouldn't have married her if Jack hadn't been president, how desperate she had been to snag Onassis for herself, and how bitter she was that Jackie managed to do it instead, how Jackie had said that Lee owed her everything, how much contempt these two women apparently had for everyone but themselves. He just spilled it all. And after all this, Quinn describes Truman as having this sort of like sadness come over him, and he declared, quote, "Her conniving against me with Gore when I was the single most loyal friend she ever had is very hurtful, to put it mildly. Love is blind. I have been in love before with people who were just ghastly. Lee was my #1 confidant until I went through that long period when I was in and out of the hospital. I wasn't communicating with anybody, but of all my friends, she never wrote me once to say she hoped I was getting well or wished me luck with my problems. As far as I know, there has never been any reason for this unbelievable conduct. I have never known her to be loyal to anyone or to say a generous thing about anyone that was not qualified. Lee is just a treacherous lady, and that's the truth of it. She is treacherous to absolutely everyone," end quote. Gore refused to drop the lawsuit though, so eventually in 1983, Truman finally settled and issued an apology, but he was like, "I don't have money," so Gore waived that and was like, yeah, whatever. But Truman was so angry at Lee that he created this piece of artwork that he called La Principessa en Vacances, so the princess on vacation. And it was this was so bizarre, like serial killer stuff almost. It was a collage that he made, and he made a bunch of these, and the other ones were okay, but this one that he made to spite Lee was a collage of cut out magazine photos on a cardboard box, which he encased in plexiglass, and he signed and everything. There was a prominent snake motif, so it was pretty obvious what he thought of Lee, and he collaged Lee into degrading sexual depictions, basically. There are no public photos of this artwork, and honestly, this really frustrates me to no end. This was sold to a private collector in 1985, and it was never seen again, so it's not even known if it still exists. And my god, what wouldn't I give to see a picture of this goddamn thing? So the whole affair ended rather tragically for Truman and Lee. They just never went back to being friends after that, and we know that Truman basically lost the lawsuit. I mean, he had to apologize and everything, and he was now known to be, if not an outright liar, then a great embellisher, right? But was he lying about this event involving Vidal and Kennedy? Vidal maintained that he was lying, but if he was, then what actually happened? In November 1961, Gore Vidal was a very busy man, occupied with both his writing career and his political aspirations as well. He was in the middle of rehearsals for a play that he'd adapted, and on the verge of deciding whether to run for Congress again or not, or to leave his political life behind altogether. On the evening of the 11th, Gore arrived to the White House dinner, thrown by his stepsister, Jackie Kennedy, and he was accompanied by historian Arthur Schlesinger and his wife, and also U.S. Ambassador to India, John Kenneth Galbraith. In the rather boring haze of the entire event, Gore eventually walked into the Red Room and came face to face with his former stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss. And Hugh D. Auchincloss was accompanied by his current wife, Janet, the mother of Jackie, obviously. And Janet didn't really like Gore Vidal. Janet didn't really like people. She was very disagreeable. But seeking to smooth out the conversation and make things easier, he decided to lead with a compliment, right? When in doubt, lead with a compliment. So Gore complimented Janet on having been such a great stepmother to his sister Nini, his younger sister Nini. And Janet, who, like I said, was combative even with people she loved, and she did not love Gore Vidal, basically replied to him by asking why he was attacking his own mother. But, Gore was surprised by her reaction. It was like, I just meant it as a compliment, I'm sorry. And he just, extricated himself from the conversation just as soon as possible. And he escaped into the adjacent room, which was the blue room. In the blue room, Gore soon breathed a sigh of relief when he caught sight of Jackie, who, unlike her mom, was very agreeable. Jackie was just a pleasant sort of person, you could always count on her to just make everything pleasant and just smooth everything out. So he went to her, and there was no available seat around her, so he just squatted next to her chair, and he held on to the back of the chair for balance, right? Because he was just squatting down on the floor. And he accidentally brushed, I guess, her shoulders and her back with his arm or something accidentally. After they chatted for a few minutes, Jackie turned to speak to someone else, and Gore felt his hand like be brusquely removed from the chair. Startled, Gore Vidal looked up and he saw Robert Kennedy, who didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked out into the red room. And Gore was like deeply offended at this obviously personal slight. I mean, you know, it wasn't an accident or anything. So he immediately like got up and went after Bobby Kennedy. Jackie hadn't even noticed the interaction. And then in the words of Gore's biographer, quote, "Don't ever do that again," Gore said to Kennedy. "Fuck off, buddy boy," Gore recalls Kennedy responding, to which one of America's most distinguished men of letters responded, "You fuck off too." Side note, is this Gore Vidal describing himself as one of America's most distinguished man of letters? Okay, I mean, work. Since clearly he had the Attorney General's ear, Gore renewed the complaint he had outlined in his Esquire article about the FBI's acting in the South as an anti-civil rights terrorist organization. Kennedy responded that it was none of his business. Gore said that as a writer, he would make it his business. Kennedy answered that he was not much of a writer. Later, Gore heard that Kennedy claimed that Gore had said, "I'll get you." No one had seen the encounter. No one else heard the dialogue, end quote. So this is Gore Vidal's account of it, right? Then, fleeing from the bad vibes, Gore went into the green room, where he proceeded to basically uneventfully interact with many people, including Lee Radziwill, Jack Kennedy's friend Lem Billings, and even Robert Kennedy's wife Ethel. Everyone was drinking a lot, and the general mood of the party became a little chaotic and on edge, according to Arthur Schlesinger. At the end of the party, apparently Jack Kennedy went up to Vidal as Gore was trying to get a cab home, and Gore said to Jack he'd like to, quote, "wring his brother's neck," unquote, to which Jack replied, quote, "Don't worry," unquote. Gore eventually left the party along with Schlesinger, Galbraith, and writer George Plimpton. The next morning, Gore called Schlesinger and told him what had happened with Robert Kennedy the night before. Schlesinger later recorded it, and this version is identical to the version told by Gore Vidal forever, basically. So his story never changed. And this is also similar to the account given by George Plimpton. Of course, we have to assume that both of these accounts came from Gore Vidal, because apparently there was nobody else in the room. But this is the closest we have to like a real account of it. It is Gore Vidal's account, but I find it believable. I mean, it's not like suspiciously favorable to him at all, and I think that it really reflects real life experiences, which are often really like underwhelming, right? I don't know, or I guess Robert Kennedy was known to be a little homophobic, so it kind of makes sense. I guess they just didn't like Gore Vidal because he was bisexual and because he was shady. Gore Vidal is a shady bitch. So if we accept Gore Vidal's version of the events as being like close enough to the truth, and I personally do, then Truman Capote's account of it was, I mean, heavily embellished at best and complete fabrication at worst. Truman would never win this lawsuit unless he had a witness come to his rescue. At least this is what he believed. In this case, it had to be Lee Radziwill, because he claimed that she was the source of this story. If she came forward and confirmed it, then Truman believed that he would defeat Vidal in court and would live happily ever after. But Lee didn't do that. Lee went instead to the opposing side and she testified against Truman. But why did she do that? Well, Lee claims that she always denied being the source of the story and that she made it clear from the start that she did not want to be dragged into this lawsuit, which she saw as a very frivolous lawsuit. It really was. It was very petty. And Lee's lawyer, this is the most important part, Lee's lawyer advised her that if she were to confirm the story or even not say anything, if she were to not say anything, she would be exposing herself to lawsuit. So basically, if she didn't make a specific statement to the contrary, she could become a co-defendant in the lawsuit, right? Vidal could amend the lawsuit to include her as a co-defendant. So Truman's idea that if she came forward and confirmed his story, they would be completely saved and would win was very far from the truth. If she confirmed his story, she would go down with him, you know, and would spend a fortune on attorney's fees. Lee did not have this money, or any money really. She just kept desperately living from rich husband to rich husband. So she gave the sworn statement that she didn't recall discussing it with Truman. This wasn't really the pro-Gore Vidal statement that Truman claimed that it was. It was more, a statement to defend herself from becoming a co-defendant in the lawsuit. Can you really blame her? Honestly, why would she risk financially ruining herself out of blind loyalty to someone that she knew to be a liar. Even if it were true, I wouldn't have judged her for saving her ass. But in this case, she actually agreed that Truman had gone too far. She privately supported Vidal, but her statement was really meant to save her own ass. This was not an attack on Truman. Inexplicably though, despite having been right so far, she then went on and declared to a reporter who was contacting her on behalf of Truman, remember Liz Smith that I mentioned before? When Lee wouldn't take Truman's calls, he pestered Liz Smith, who was a reporter, into contacting Lee for him on his behalf, and she did. So even though Lee was very much, I think, justified in her actions, I don't think that she was wrong to save her own ass. I mean, it was a lawsuit. So despite her having been right, she went on and blabbed to this reporter that she, quote, just couldn't. The notoriety of it is too much. I am tired of Truman riding on my coattails to fame. And Liz, what difference does it make? They're just a couple of end quote. As we know, this dismissiveness really enraged Truman, and he basically declared war on Lee. Her then fiance, Newton Cope, claims that Lee told him, quote, the little worm is threatening to sue me, end quote. And interestingly, he believed that something specific that nobody else knew about had actually happened between Lee and Truman to cause such a rift. I mean, not just naturally growing apart, because when he asked her about Truman Capote one day, she just said, quote, that little creep, end quote, and refused to say anything else about it. What could Truman have done to inspire such disdain? She certainly seemed to become a lot more homophobic toward Truman throughout the 70s. This leads me to believe that whatever happened, if there was such an event, it had something to do with Truman's gayness somehow. And it's really interesting that her own ex-fiance would say something like that. I mean, this is a person that would have intimate access to them, right? I think it's, if not likely, then I think it's very possible that something did happen. But we'll never know, I think. I mean, unless she told someone, we will never know what happened. Truman seemed to be at a loss, like he couldn't think of anything, which either means that he doesn't remember whatever happened, or that he gives it no importance or weight in the way that she does, which means either it was like some kind of homophobic thing on her part and Truman was just like oblivious to it, or he was so vile that he just didn't realize that he was doing something gross. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it could have been. And then the boyfriend thing with Peter Beard, but she said that Truman wanted to separate them, that he was the F slur. It's just weird. Lee's history with homosexual men was a complex one. Her own father, Black Jack Bouvier, his name was Jack Bouvier, but he was called Black Jack because he had very dark skin. Well, he was white, but kind of a dark skin, like really tan. And because he was kind of a black sheep, he was definitely the kind of person that would calculate his self-worth according to the number of people he could sleep with. And it was rumored that Black Jack Bouvier was also hooking up with men, which I don't doubt at all. And he looked just like Jackie. Anyway, I think he's interesting. I may do a video on him at a certain point, at any point in the future, maybe. So Black Jack Bouvier was alleged by some to have hooked up with men, been bisexual. I guess we would apply that label nowadays, even though he probably wouldn't, even if he hadn't been in the closet, like most queer men at the time. So he was alleged by some to have been bisexual, hungrily pursuing lovers of both genders to satisfy his sex addiction. Anyway, this is my speculation. I don't know if he was a sex addict. It certainly sounds like it. Although I presume that Lee likely didn't know about the whole hooking up with men thing, she knew of his philandering. She knew that he was a whore. And she and Jackie, in a way, they were kind of proud of it. Super weird. So they had this father that was, really like into showing off his conquests. Oh, there's a very infamous picture with Black Jack Bouvier and his then wife Janet, the mother of Jackie and Lee. And Black Jack Bouvier is actually holding hands with another woman behind his wife's back in the picture. He was so obvious about it too. I mean, this was one of the reasons why she left him. And Jackie and Lee, they kind of thought that was cool. They were kind of like proud of their dad, who was like a ladies' man, which is just, what in the internalized misogyny, anyways. I mean, it makes sense why Jackie ended up with Jack, but that's a topic for another video. He also had a very idiosyncratic way to dress, and just the way he presented himself to the world. Black Jack was very vain. Again, both Lee and Jackie deeply admire this in him, the fact that he was so stylish, that he was such a dandy, that he was kind of a metrosexual. His dandiness, in fact, may have sparked their original interest in fashion because they had this reference of their dad, who was the stylish man, right? That was her first, I think, strong relationship with a queer man, even though she didn't know about it. Lee was briefly married to a closeted gay man called Michael Canfield. This was her first husband before she married the prince. Sources at the time claimed she felt hurt and confused by his lack of sexual interest in her, and they eventually got their marriage annulled thanks to Kennedy interference, because she and Prince Radziwill were both Catholic, and it was important to his family that they married in the church. However, she had been married already. She was divorced. So basically, in order to marry in the Catholic Church, because they were all Catholic, she would have to have her first marriage annulled. And the Kennedys had to like keep writing to the Pope to get it annulled. Then they finally got it, and she married Radziwill in the church and everything. Staj, they call him Staj. But ironically, at the time when she finally married in the church, her husband, Prince Radziwill, she was already checked out of the marriage at that point. Remember when she met Truman? She already told him that her marriage wasn't really going well. She was kind of ambivalent about it. While she was married to Staj, she'd get very close with dancer Rudolf Nureyev. Now, Rudolf Nureyev was known to have been involved with both women and men, right? Even though he's usually more associated with his relationships with men. When they met in 1962, their connection was immediate. So much so that she even invited him to stay at the Radziwill's London home while he was visiting as a guest for the Royal Ballet. He ended up staying there for 7 months, and he would visit frequently, even when he got his own home, you know. Lee would throw him birthday parties. She would go antique hunting with him at 3 a.m. because after his shows, he had like so much adrenaline that he couldn't go to sleep. And Nureyev was also known to have like a very extravagant personal style. I mean, you know, Blackjack Bouvier coded. In terms of clout too, her like snagging Nureyev right at the cusp of his like career in the West blowing up. This was huge for Nureyev, but it was also huge for Lee, since he would go on to become basically like the first pop icon of the 60s, right? One of the first. She loved being around his glamorous dancer friends, such as Margot Fontaine, and she was enchanted by his eclectic curiosity. He just wanted to know about anything at all. He was very hungry for knowledge, and she loved that about him. Obviously, she was drawn to these artists, and it's easy to see why, but they were also drawn to her. According to Nureyev, quote, "Lee is very beautiful, very bright. After all, she's not just a socialite. She attracts people of substance." Some sources claim that they were romantically involved when living in London, that everyone knew they were an item. Not only were they spending so much of their time together, but Lee even supposedly went to Russia to meet his family. Lee herself has revealed that she felt very drawn to his, quote, intense animal passion, unquote. But Nureyev's homosexual side was a source of frustration for her. She once told Truman how disturbed she was at finding pictures of naked men in Nureyev's home, basically just hating the implication that he was attracted and actively sleeping with men, and she even like refused to accept it. So even if their relationship was completely platonic and just a crush on Lee's side, basically, they were very physical with each other. Like, Nureyev was very physically affectionate with her. And according to Gerald Smith, who was a regular guest at the Radziwill's home in London at the time, Lee and Rudolph's body language really suggested that they were lovers. So this is the second man, the second queer man that Lee Radziwill has a weird relationship with that people from the outside think they're lovers, but he's gay. I feel like her closeness to this man, who was very attracted to her, clearly cared about her, sought out her company, thought she was intelligent, interesting, was physically affectionate with her, liked her children, was intellectually stimulating, was an accomplished artist, and one of the best in his field. And his field, ballet, I mean, was so beautiful, so elevated, so European. He was part of this cool and sophisticated milieu of artists, people with actual substance, and all of these elements I think satisfied Lee in a way that no straight man or husband ever had and ever could. And I think this frustrated her to no end that she couldn't have both. And there are reports that Nureyev had relationships with women. Apparently, Nureyev's personal assistant, Joan Thring, states that he wanted to marry Margot Fontaine, and dancer Avril Bergen claims that she overheard Nureyev and Fontaine discussing a pregnancy and a miscarriage. Even if he was bisexual, his homosexual side was far more prominent, and most people thought that he was gay. And to Lee, the fact that he didn't seem to want her, at least not to the extent that she wanted him to want her. I mean, that was probably tantamount to rejection to her. It probably didn't help that Nureyev reportedly liked Jackie better than Lee. No end to the humiliation. And for an ignorant mind, and I mean this, not in a shady way, but like an ignorant mind, meaning somebody who isn't aware of things the way we are today, I think that blaming the homosexuality of these men was in a way sort of a tactic to avoid accountability for her own flaws. Obviously, that doesn't make it okay on any level or justified in any way, but I'm just trying to speculate, on how her mind may have worked. She was also casual friends with Andy Warhol, whom she met through her photographer boyfriend, Peter Beard. At the time, Warhol himself was kind of beginning to crave clout a little bit and, glamour. I mean, he already had notoriety at the time, but this sort of awoke in him the desire to, also be part of that exclusive circle of high society. And his connection with Lee certainly opened a lot of doors for him in that regard, because high society at the time really kind of feared him. People were scared of him. I mean, drag queens, and gay people. I mean, he was shot by a lesbian, but with Lee on his side, he had an entry into that world, and people were less scared of him. Lee and Andy loved to gossip about their mutual acquaintances. So once again, gossip is the glue that holds us all together. So they hung out, had meals all the time just to gossip. And after Lee's falling out with Truman, he supposedly called Andy, who described Truman's anger at Lee as scary and warned Truman against retaliating, reportedly telling him, quote, "Truman, she's so weak now, she might commit suicide," end quote. Annoyed, Truman threatened to tell Andy all the cruel things Lee had said about Andy behind his back, to which Andy replied, quote, "I don't care. I've always known what kind of a person she was," end quote. Andy later said to another friend, quote, "If Lee was drinking before this feud with Truman, can you imagine now?" End quote. So on top of all that, add a layer of misery in the form of alcoholism as well. According to Lee's biographer, on another occasion, when Andy was told that Lee labeled him a social climber, he answered, quote, "Well, she's a talent climber," end quote. I think Andy knew how to deal with her in the healthiest way. I loved his answer to Truman. He was like, "I don't care. I know who she is. I know what kind of a person she is." So Andy recognized that she was likely to talk about him behind his back, and he was like, "I don't care. I know what this relationship is. I know what this person is about. I choose to engage on these terms. I respect that." And then, of course, there was Truman. In Lee's cast of gay characters in her life, there was Truman, a gay man that she once considered her best friend in the whole world, the only person with whom she had ever shared her deepest insecurities. Their intense closeness was also often described as quasi-romantic, if you'll remember, and the breaking up of their friendship was certainly more devastating for both of them than most romantic relationships that they had. This left scars for both of them. By the 1970s, Truman's well-documented drug and alcohol abuse was at its peak, and his sorry behavior pushed away several people, including Lee. Her biographer states that at this point, Lee was beginning to see clearly his tendency to lie and pit his friends against each other. So she was starting to see him for what he was, what he had always been, honestly. But I think with the alcoholism, the drug abuse, it was easier to see the bad. All of the red flags that you ignored are made very, very clear. And interestingly, Lee felt that Truman was squandering his gift as a writer. And this is a really important thing because Truman Capote, although he was a very good writer, he wasn't a very prolific one. And after In Cold Blood, which was his most successful book, he never finished another novel again. He finished short stories, but he didn't finish a novel. And isn't that crazy? Like, he got so caught up in this world of socialites and gossip and glamour and clout, and he sort of lost sight of the one thing that really mattered, which was his writing talent. And he went to his grave with this delusion that he was going to finish Answered Prayers, which was to be his masterpiece, right? And it just never happened. He just couldn't finish it. And it's interesting that Lee, as a friend who was so admiring of his artistic side, the fact that he was an artist, he was an author, she felt really sad and frustrated to see him squandering it. I mean, not only was Truman's sickness something that she couldn't really do anything about, but Lee herself was not at her most mentally stable. Remember what Andy Warhol reportedly said? If Lee was drinking before this feud with Truman, how is she now? Like, can you imagine? So she wasn't well mentally at that point. Andy implied that she was suicidal. He said to Truman, don't do this, don't retaliate, don't attack her, she's gonna kill herself. Can you imagine, like, at what point does she have to be for a friend who's not even that close to her, like Andy, know that she's suicidal or that she's very close to being? She wasn't well. And it's hard enough to deal with somebody who you love, who has addiction, which is a disease, it's an illness, but it's unimaginably harder when you yourself aren't at your best mentally, if you're depressed, but especially if you're also abusing substances. This was a clusterfuck. There was no way this was gonna work. This friendship was doomed. Her own life was in shambles, and her relationships were all deteriorating. And really, I think the bottom line is that in this entire process, her refusal to stand by Truman in court, her refusal to confirm what she knew was a lie, was not about betraying her old friend. It was just self-preservation. Sadly, despite his hope that they would eventually make peace with each other, Truman Capote and Lee Radziwill remained on bad terms until his death in 1984. Lee, who lived until 2019, when asked relatively recently whether she missed Truman, apparently she confessed, quote, "I do. Yes, I do. I had wonderful times with Truman. Wonderful times. There is nobody who is like him. There is nobody who even reminds me of him at all," end quote. So what do you guys think? Was this really a double cross? Did Truman Capote have it coming after his shenanigans with the Swans, receiving some kind of karmic justice for how he hurt Babe Paley with the publication of La Côte Basque? Or do you think Lee's actions were warranted? I think they were, honestly. I think that she was just trying to preserve herself. I don't blame her. I would have done the same thing, especially knowing it was a lie. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment. And if you enjoyed this video, please take the time to like and subscribe as well. We're just starting out. This channel is just a baby. So doing this can really help us be found by other vintage gossip enthusiasts. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Till then, keep restless.